Post-war economies. What were the economic effects of the Civil War? So when we talk about economic or economy, we're talking about money. War is a very expensive endeavor. It requires soldiers and uniforms, weapons, ammunition, food, and medical care. Wherever battles are fought, buildings and land are usually destroyed at great monetary and human cost. According to some historians, the Civil War cost the nation about $6.6 billion. This was almost twice as much as the total value of goods and services produced in the United States at the beginning of the war. While both the North and the South lost many soldiers and endured great human suffering, most of the war's economic devastation was centered in the South. Okay, the war is expensive. You have to pay soldiers, you have to clothe them with uniforms, you have to give them weapons to fight with, and they need bullets to put in their weapons. They need to eat and they need to have medical care if they're injured. Okay, so a lot of money goes into war. They say the Civil War cost about $6.6 billion. That's a whole bunch of moolah. Before the Civil War, the South had a very strong agricultural economy with very little industry. Southern states sold much of their cotton and other crops to Northern industrialists who produced clothing and other goods in their factories. When war began in 1861, the Confederates had very few factories that could produce the weapons and other supplies soldiers needed to defeat the Union. Everything had to be imported, and this required money. But because the states of the North no longer purchased Southern cotton, where would this money come from? Okay, so we know that before the Civil War, the South had an agricultural economy. They didn't really grow food, they grew cotton and tobacco, right? And they exported it out, and that's how they got their money. Okay, but unfortunately, most of the places they sold it to were the northern states. Well, when the North and the South went to war, the North stopped purchasing from the South and they didn't want their cotton anymore. So, how did the South get the money that they needed for the war? Like the U.S. federal government, the Confederacy printed its own paper money during the Civil War. However, the U.S. government was able to sell bonds and raise taxes to support its new currency. The Confederates had few banks that could sell bonds, and the Confederate government was unable to collect taxes from its states. As the Confederacy printed more money to fight the war, Confederate dollars became worth less over time. This created inflation, a condition in which prices increase as the purchasing value of money goes down. By the time the war ended in 1865, inflation in the South was at 9,000%. Even before the war was lost, the Confederate dollar had no value. Many Southerners had their savings wiped out, and the only way to do business was to barter. Okay, so the North, the Union side, was way stronger. Okay, they had the US government behind them. So they could raise taxes, they could sell bonds, they could print the new currency, and they could support it. The Confederates, they didn't have banks that could do this. Okay, they couldn't collect taxes from their states. So the Confederate, the dollar in the Confederate, the value of it went right down the drains. Okay, it really went down, and the cost of everything went up. So by the end of the war, many Confederates and Southerners, they didn't have any money left. All the money they had saved was gone. So in order to do business, they couldn't be like, oh, here's $10, because they didn't have $10. They would barter, which means, hey, I have this sweatshirt and I want some grains. Let's trade. Inflation wasn't the only economic problem in the South after the war. The South had also lost valuable property and resources. Not only land and buildings, but also about one-third of its farm animals and about half of its farm equipment and machinery. Many of the factories and railroads the South had before the Civil War were destroyed by the Union Army. Major cities such as Charleston and Atlanta were almost completely burned to the ground. Before the war, the net value of all property held by residents of South Carolina was $400 million. By 1865, this figure dropped to $50 million. Another huge economic loss for the South was enslaved persons. This loss of human property was valued at about $2.5 billion. Total wealth in the South fell by an estimated 40% between 1861 and 1865. Okay, so inflation, their money going down and the cost of things going up, that wasn't the only problem the South had, okay? They lost buildings, they lost property, they lost their resources. They lost farm animals, they lost farm equipment, railroads and factories that they had wiped out, destroyed, okay, from the war. So lots of things were burned down or lost or gone because of the war, okay. Before the war, the South Carolina was about worth 400 million. By 1865, the end of the war, they were only worth 50 million. That's a $350 million loss, you guys. That's huge. Okay. You got to remember also the South lost something really important and worth a lot of money to them, which were their slaves. Okay. Their slaves did a lot of work for them and had a lot of value, and they lost that property. It's terrible to call people property, but that's what that is. After the Civil War, it was clear that the North was the nation's dominant economic center. While the South lay in economic and physical shambles, many Northern industrialists had actually made money off the war. Northern factories had profited by supplying the Union Army with weapons and other goods. Northern farming had also grown during the war because the Union was not purchasing crops from the South and needed to feed its great army. Because so much of the war had been fought in the South, the North did not have to face the expensive task of rebuilding. Okay, so after the war, the North came out on top. They had more money. Um, they had actually made money during the war because they were making weapons and other goods. They had also, their farming industry had grown more because they stopped buying agricultural or farming things from the South, so they were doing it their own. So the South was like decimated or in shambles, not doing good at all after the war, and the northern states they were in really good shape.